The Association of Advertisers in Ireland are delighted to welcome Gabrielle Robitaille, Digital Policy Manager of the World Federation of Advertisers, as a guest for our Toolkit webinar this morning. In this session, Gabrielle will provide you with a summary of the latest developments, expected next steps, and WFA action on all relevant EU digital policy files likely to have far-reaching impacts on the digital advertising market. Gabrielle will look at recent moves to regulate online platforms via the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, and how these could result in increased transparency in the digital advertising market and support advertisers' brand safety efforts. The state of play on the ePrivacy regulation, which will set new rules on the use of cookies within the EU, plans to introduce an EU-wide digital levy and how this could have unintended consequences on advertisers, and proposals to introduce new rules on transparency in political advertising and how these could inadvertently impact commercial advertisers. About Gabrielle, or Gabby as she's known within the WFA, Gabby works on key digital files such as the ePrivacy regulation and the upcoming Digital Services Act. Before the WFA, she worked at the Motion Picture Association. She holds a bachelor's degree in modern languages and European studies from the University of Bath and a master in European politics and international relations from Maastricht University. Gabby speaks English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Dutch, but no Irish, as I said earlier on to Gabby. The AAI are a member of the Policy Action Group within the WFA, and from what Gabby is about to present, you will see that one of the key points is, why is all of this important for advertisers, and what are the obligations for online platforms in terms of brand safety? This is really important, and you need to be able to answer potential questions from senior management if you're challenged at all. For example, will digital taxes result in increases in the price of digital advertising, which is expected to account for in excess of 50% of the total advertising expenditure in the Republic of Ireland in 2021? And Gabby will outline the WFA's position on all of these digital issues. We in the AAI adopt these principles and positioning from a local perspective. If anyone has any Q&As, please raise a hand or put them through the chat box. The only other item I need to mention too is Brian Roach from Owens DDB is here to manage the tech. As always, hopefully it will be seamless and it will work okay. I'm now back on camera, so if I go out of focus, it doesn't matter, I've done my bit. Gabby, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks for participating.
Thanks so much, Barry. Hi, everyone. That was a very thorough introduction, so I don't think I need to cover much more, but let me just get up my slides. Hopefully you should all be able to see this now. So yes, as Barry said, I'm Gabby, I'm Digital Policy Manager at WFA, and I'm really here today to talk about all the EU files and proposals and regulations that are coming out of the EU right now, ranging from platform regulation to digital taxes to new rules on political advertising. And I'll hopefully cover what they could mean for advertisers in practice, not only in the EU, but also beyond. So just before getting started, I just wanted to give a brief, I wanted to briefly introduce who the World Federation of Advertisers is, in case anyone is unfamiliar. So we bring together over 120 of the world's largest brands to enable more effective, efficient, and sustainable marketing. We also bring together more than 60 national advertiser associations through our National Advertiser Association network. And our main purpose is really to enable better marketing. And we do this by enabling our members to connect and share best practice and explore solutions to common challenges. We help our members by providing strategic advice and intelligence on major issues affecting advertising. And we work with our members to better understand, manage, and respond to major industry issues. And before kind of deep diving into the numerous issues that are at stake, I just wanted to briefly kind of mention what WFA's digital policy priorities are, which might help to give a bit more context as to why we're looking at these particular files, given that they link quite perfectly with some of the regulatory proposals that are coming out of the EU at the moment. So firstly, Barry mentioned it, brand safety. It's a top priority for advertisers. Advertisers obviously want to make sure that their ad spend isn't inadvertently funding harmful or illegal content. That's why back in 2019, we at WFA set up the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. So it's a cross-industry initiative made up of platforms, agency and advertisers, which is really aimed at preventing the monetization of harmful content online and driving a safer and more transparent media ecosystem. So in the EU, policymakers have just put forward a new proposal known as the EU Digital Services Act, which is aimed at tackling the spread of illegal and harmful content online and regulating big tech platforms. And as we'll see later, some of the measures introduced there could be quite helpful from a brand safety perspective. Then secondly, we carried out a survey in the middle of last year with WFA's corporate members into digital advertising and advertisers' experience in working with advertising partners, to which over 70% of corporate advertiser respondents said that they encounter a lack of data sharing when working with large online platforms, which they say impacts their ability to measure the performance of their ads, audit ad spend, understand where their ads are being placed, and also understand consumer trends and preferences. So at the end of last year, the European Commission put forward a legislative proposal which is aimed at really driving more competition in digital markets, including in the digital advertising market, and tackle the perceived dominance of so-called gatekeeper platforms, so platforms that have dominance in different digital markets, by introducing a number of measures which are really aimed at forcing some of these platforms to share more data with their business users, including advertisers. And as we'll see later, this could potentially help address some of those concerns that some of the corporate members had raised in the survey that we carried out. As a third priority then, which Barry touched upon as well, policymakers across the world are looking to introduce digital services taxes. So these are taxes on revenues generated from the provision of certain digital activities that can include from provision of online advertising space or services, and it has become increasingly commonplace that such taxes, which are really targeted at large online platforms, gets passed on to platforms' business users, including advertisers, thereby resulting in increases in the price of digital advertising. So in the EU, policymakers are currently in the process of preparing their own EU digital tax, and we'll go through what that could potentially mean for advertisers on an EU level, and then how WFA are responding to this. And then finally, privacy has been really a top priority for many years now, especially following the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. So while countries all over the world are in the process of implementing or continuing to put forward privacy regulations, which are really heavily influenced on the General Data Protection Regulation, we're also seeing changes within the EU as the EU sets its sights on introducing new rules on the use of cookies and other types of trackers. So these are really the four key issues that I'll be tackling today. And as Barry said, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and I can get to them at the end. So I'm going to start with our first priority, which is brand safety. So over recent years within the EU, but definitely not limited only to the EU, big tech platforms have really come under increased scrutiny for the way that they deal with illegal and harmful content on their sites, with many claiming that the current regulation, which broadly exempts big tech platforms from being held responsible for the content that circulates on their websites, are no longer fit for purpose. At the same time, we've seen policymakers and NGOs increasingly focused on online advertising, given that advertising revenues fund not only the business model of the internet, but therefore also much of the content that circulates online. So in December, the EU published a legislative proposal which is essentially aimed at upgrading some of these current rules, setting out how platforms should be regulated and address the spread of illegal, harmful content, all with the aims of kind of protecting and safeguarding users' fundamental rights online and ensuring a well-functioning internal market which enables new services to scale and grow. And there are really two key reasons why this piece of regulation, which is now under consideration in the legislative process, are relevant for advertisers. So firstly, the EU proposal introduces obligations that online platforms have to carry out to prevent the spread of illegal content on their site. So the proposal actually maintains that online platforms are not responsible or liable for the presence of illegal content on their sites unless they become aware of it. But some of the proposed obligations could support advertisers' brand safety efforts and prevent advertising revenues from funding illegal or harmful content, which I'll get to in a moment. And then the second reason why this proposal is important for advertisers is that, as I mentioned, online advertising has come under increased scrutiny. The proposal notes that online advertising can contribute to many different risks online, such as illegal advertising or contributing as a financial incentive to the spread or amplification of harmful content, or to the discriminatory display of advertising. So in order to address these risks, the Digital Services Act introduces measures which are really aimed at promoting online advertising transparency, mainly aimed at ensuring that users better understand why they're viewing particular ads and prevent the discriminatory display of advertising. And of course, while some of these measures could help prevent things like fraudulent advertising or help drive more transparency in the digital advertising market, they could also result in advertisers having to disclose commercially sensitive information. So if we look firstly to the kind of obligations that are introduced in the Digital Services Act, which aim to drive more accountability and responsibility online for the spread of illegal content. As I mentioned, some of these could support advertisers' brand safety efforts. So firstly, all online platforms will be required to publish regular transparency reports with detailed information about their content moderation activities. So, for example, the number of orders that they receive to remove illegal content, the number of notices that users issued, more information on what kind of voluntary content moderation activities they undertake, and the number of complaints they receive. So harmonized reporting standards across platforms is something that we at WFA have advocated for, as it really helps advertisers better understand what safeguards are in place to reduce the dissemination of illegal or harmful content, and then enables advertisers to tailor brand safety efforts accordingly. Then secondly, large online platforms, so think Facebook and Google, will have to carry out annual assessments of the risks that are stemming from the use and functioning of their services, particularly regarding the spread of illegal content and manipulation of their services. So think presence of fake accounts and bots. They'll also have to put in place measures to decrease these risks, such as preventing advertising revenues from funding specific content. So again, this will help advertisers better understand the risks that are associated with advertising on different platforms, and some of the risk mitigation measures specifically will prevent content from being funded by advertising revenues. And then finally, online platforms will also have to carry out independent audits at least once a year and publish an audit report of all their content moderation policies and activities. So again, this is something that we at WFA have been advocating for, as it will help drive that accountability of platforms' content moderation systems, and also help ensure that these systems can be improved. So basically, a lot of the obligations that are introduced in the Digital Services Act address some of the concerns that we have been raising with policymakers previously, and could contribute greatly to advertisers' brand safety efforts in order to promote a safer an online environment for both advertisers as well as for consumers. A lot of the measures, so the standardized reporting, the risk assessments, and the auditing are also complementary to the work of the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, which, as I mentioned, is this cross-industry initiative aimed at driving more transparency into how ads are placed online, and also prevent the monetization of harmful content. So that's the brand safety aspect. And then I want to focus on the online advertising aspect. So as I mentioned, online advertising plays quite a big role in the Digital Services Act proposal. The European Commission believes that online advertising transparency measures are necessary and sufficient to tackle some of the risks and harms associated with online advertising, such as illegal advertising, fraudulent advertising, or the fact that advertising revenues can act as an amplifier of illegal content. So there are really 3 steps that the Digital Services Act introduces to help promote online advertising transparency. So the first is aimed at the ads that users see in real time, and all online platforms will have to include or disclose information enabling users to identify that the content in question is an ad, who paid for the ad, and finally, meaningful information about the main parameters used to determine who the ad was displayed to. So essentially the targeting criteria. Just a point to note here is that it still remains quite unclear what policymakers mean when they say platforms will have to disclose targeting criteria. We're not sure where the responsibility will lie. Will that essentially lie on the advertiser, or will that lie on the platform? But this is likely to be kind of a point in discussions between policymakers in the EU to assess and define what that will mean in practice. Next, Google and Facebook, so the big platforms, will also have to create a public ad repository with detailed information about each individual ad that's published on their website, which would be available for a year after the ad was served. So here we have advertisers have some concerns and reservations about the potential commercial and competition implications that these ad repositories could have. These ad repositories would be available to the public, and essentially they would force platforms to disclose who the advertiser is for each individual ad. So it would mean that online platforms would have to say who their advertising clients are. They'd also have to disclose the main targeting criteria. So that forces advertisers to essentially publicly disclose their marketing strategies. And it also forces platforms to disclose how many recipients each ad reached. And that would essentially give away advertisers' market share, which could then be used really to determine how much money a brand is paying on a given platform. So there's really a few concerns, again, about what this could mean in practice. Just as the point above, this is really just the initial starting position. There's a lot of points that still need to be ironed out. But the general feeling here is that a public ad repository wouldn't be that helpful from a consumer perspective, given that the Commission's objectives really here are to increase transparency for individual users, and it remains, there's a question mark as to how consumers would benefit from having a kind of ad repository like this. And then finally, the Digital Services Act will encourage and facilitate the development of codes of conduct on online advertising between online platforms and other relevant service providers, including advertisers, to contribute and further transparency in online advertising. So on the basis of these 3 points, some of these provisions could be quite positive. They could help contribute to a more transparent digital advertising market. If we think that platforms will have to disclose who the advertiser is behind each ad, that could help things like fraudulent advertising or illegal advertising. But again, there are some potential commercial implications here. And as I said, this is by no means the final text. So what happens now is that member state representatives, along with the European Parliament, have to come to their own agreement on a position on this legislative proposal. So there's quite some scope for many of these provisions to be changed, which kind of brings me on to the next point, which is that some policymakers especially within the European Parliament, have reacted to this proposal by saying that online advertising transparency measures are not enough, and that the Digital Services Act should in fact be proposing a ban on targeted advertising based on pervasive user tracking. And it's important really to acknowledge here that the broader debate now that is servicing is no longer just about whether, whether platforms have enough responsibility or accountability for the spread of illegal and harmful content on their sites. The broader debate that's surfacing is that some policymakers is that there's a fundamental issue with big tech's business model and the ad-funded model of the internet. So regulators and NGOs alike in both the EU and the US are claiming that this business model, which enables big tech to collect vast amounts of data, to track and profile individuals and groups, and then serve content to them based on their behavioral history, their identity, their relationship interests, which is now some people refer to as surveillance advertising, means that platforms are increasingly curating content to serve to their users. And given that extremist content is often the content that generates the most user engagement, platforms are amplifying this kind of content to keep users hooked on the platform, which then they can then profit from financially. So policymakers and NGOs are claiming that a way to kind of tackle and solve this problem is to essentially ban targeted advertising or behavioral advertising in favor of what they consider as less intrusive forms of advertising, such as contextual advertising. They feel that contextual advertising could potentially support the traditional news industry, and prevent this big tech platforms from essentially undermining democracy, which is what many policymakers are arguing at the moment. Which brings me on to what our general position on this kind of regulation, on the Digital Services Act is. And this is a position that we will be advocating for at EU level, but also globally as debates around how to regulate big tech continue to emerge. So firstly, on those obligations for platforms, we're really supportive of these harmonized transparency reporting, the risk assessments, risk mitigation measures, and the independent auditing, because we really feel that that they are helpful and useful from a brand safety perspective, and that they also are quite complementary to some of the initiatives that we're currently working on with the rest of the industry. When it comes to the online advertising transparency measures, our position is that we support advertising transparency to consumers in real time, but that we have some competition, like some competitive concerns relating to the sharing of commercially sensitive information when it comes to those ad repositories. And then when it comes to the broader discussions on targeted advertising, we don't necessarily believe that banning targeted advertising or behavioral advertising in favor of, let's say, contextual advertising would prevent the spread of illegal content online and remove those economic incentives that are associated with it. So instead, we think the focus really should be on ensuring the demonetization of this kind of harmful content, and ensuring that there are more safeguards to prevent the monetization of this kind of content. So that's our overall position at the time being. Of course, it's subject to change. As negotiations go on, we will, of course, be adapting it and working with our members to ensure that the advertiser perspective is heard at EU level. So just briefly on next steps, I really just want to put this here just to highlight that we're very much at the early stages. This is the initial proposal that the European Commission has introduced. I don't want to get too bogged down into the procedural process within the EU, but there's the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the member states and the Council all need to come to an agreement on what a final text will look like. So we've still got quite a long road ahead of us before an adoption of a regulation. So we're envisaging the adoption of a regulation around 2023, and then an implementation deadline. So when the rules will become applicable somewhere between 2023 and 2025. So that was the brand safety, that's the Digital Services Act. And I now want to go on to our second priority, which is the access to data piece. So in parallel to this Digital Services Act proposal, the European Commission also published a proposal for the Digital Markets Act. So the context behind this one is that the Commission and the EU policymakers are arguing that a small number of very large online platforms platforms capture the biggest share of the overall value generated in the digital economy. So they benefit from a number of characteristics such as strong network effects, vertical integration, access to vast amounts of data, and that they now also intermediate the majority of transactions between end users and business users. So this small handful of large platforms increasingly act as a gateway or as gatekeepers between business users and end users, with many businesses now entirely dependent on them to access their end users. So the main objective really of this regulation is to tackle any unfair practices by gatekeeper platforms, improve conditions for business users, and ensure that EU digital markets are contestable and fair. And the key pillar really of the Digital Markets Act that's important for advertisers is increased data sharing for business users, including for advertisers. So the Commission acknowledges that gatekeepers are able to leverage their access to large amounts of data from one area activity to a new one and give themselves an unfair advantage over other companies. So it therefore wants to ensure that all services operating on or using platforms, business services, are able to access and benefit from the same amounts of data. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, back in August, we carried out a survey with WFA corporate members to see what difficulties they encountered when working with large online advertising platforms. And overall, over 79% of respondents said that they encounter a lack of data sharing when working with large online advertising platforms. So some of the proposed measures in the Digital Markets Act could go some way in addressing these challenges. When it comes to online advertising in particular, the Digital Markets Act actually notes that the way that gatekeepers, so gatekeepers are Google, Facebook, Amazon, the way that they provide online advertising services is often non-transparent and opaque, which means that advertisers and publishers don't have all the information they need to understand how much they are paying for ads and to properly measure how their ads are performing. So the Digital Markets Act introduces two obligations which are particularly relevant for advertisers. So firstly, they introduce an obligation for gatekeepers to provide advertisers with information concerning the price paid for the publishing of an ad, as well as for all the relevant advertising services provided by the gatekeeper. And if we look at the results from our survey, corporate members said that 57% of advertisers lack transparency regarding the price of advertising. So this kind of obligation in a regulation could go some way in addressing this issue. Secondly, the Digital Markets Act introduces an obligation for gatekeepers to provide advertisers with access to the performance measuring tools of the online platform and all the information necessary for advertisers to carry out their own independent verification of ad inventory. So if we look again to the survey, 86% of WFA's corporate member respondents said that they lack the data necessary to measure the quality and effectiveness of their ads. So this obligation could address this concern and better help advertisers understand how their ads are performing online. And then thirdly, as a final point, and this is less specific to advertising, but still very relevant, is that the Digital Markets Act obliges large online platforms to provide business users with access to the data that's generated in their context of their use of the platform services. So data generated from users engaging in business users' products or services. So according to our survey, 68% of WFA corporate members say they lack consumer data when working with large online advertising platforms. So these kinds of data and insights will be really helpful for advertisers. So again, we've developed a global position, a general position on the Digital Markets Act, which we will be advocating for at EU level in the coming months. So overall, our general position is that we're very supportive of obligations for platforms to share more data with advertisers, but we do believe that more granularity is needed to ensure that these obligations are properly enforced in practice. So when it comes to the measurement data, we think that while access to platforms measuring tools is a good start, we actually think that platforms should be obliged to provide advertisers with access to the raw data that they need to carry out their own performance measuring and independent verification. So we think also that platforms should allow access to third-party measurement providers, and that data should be provided in kind of these standardized formats. And then secondly, on ad pricing, we again think that more granularity is needed regarding what types of pricing data platforms should share with advertisers, and believe that platforms should also be obliged to be more transparent about the way that they determine the prices and the way that auctions are carried out within their environments. So this would drive more transparency in the supply chain, but also ensure non-discriminatory and fair pricing. And then finally, on the consumer data piece, we just think that there needs to be a little bit more clarity so that platforms should be required to provide access to all the data that's generated from the use of the platform services, so that gatekeepers basically can't continue to just pick and choose what data they share with advertisers or with their business users. Now, again, finally, just on the tentative timetable and next steps, this is very much similar to the previous proposal. So we've just entered the legislative process, which means there's still a long road ahead before the adoption of a final regulation. And again, we can envisage a sort of implementation deadline somewhere between 2023 and 2025. So that brings me on to the next point. Now, I really want to be brief here because, as I said, as I kind of mentioned before, this isn't one of our main priorities, but it does fit into the last two proposals. So EU policymakers, alongside tackling illegal and harmful content and the market power of gatekeepers, they're also looking at how to drive more transparency in sponsored political content and what they refer to as issue-based advertising, in order to foster a more transparent and accountable digital ecosystem and strengthen democracy and tackle disinformation online. So the EU, they recently launched a consultation. They're currently gathering views and evidence, which will then inform a legislative proposal on political and issues-based advertising, which will be published in the summer of this year, I believe. So the European Commission is actually assessing whether to introduce common definitions of political and issue-based advertising, given that these vary from member state to member state. They're looking at introducing new transparency obligations for political advertising and issues advertising, similar, in fact, to those that are introduced in the Digital Services Act proposal. And they're also looking at potentially restricting micro-targeting and behavioural profiling in the political context. So as WFA, our priority here really is to just avoid that any regulation aimed specifically at political advertising doesn't inadvertently extend to or create new obligations for advertising or advertisers which are purely commercial. So we want a clear distinction between political and issues-based advertising and commercial advertising. In particular, we really want a clear differentiation between issues ads, which are driven by political motive or for political purposes on the one hand, so ads about a particular referendum, an issue that's coming up in a particular referendum, and on the other hand, issues ads driven by commercial motives on the other. So to promote the image of a brand in order to influence consumers' transaction decisions in relation to products or services. So this idea of this purpose-driven marketing. So an ad that's highlighting the need to consider mental health, for example, in the context of, I don't know, working from home, or potential issues an issues ad on, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is less related or which is carried out not for political motives. So I really just want to say that I just wanted to put this in here, that this is something that WFA is monitoring closely when we're looking at all developments, and our advocacy will really just be limited to ensuring that there is this clear distinction between political advertising and commercial advertising. We won't be advocating, for example, on how political advertising should be regulated online. Okay, so that brings me on to the next priority, which is privacy. So some of you may be familiar or have heard of the ePrivacy regulation, which is a proposed regulation that has been under consideration and under debate by EU policymakers now for just over 4 years. I just want to start with what the ePrivacy regulation is and what it could mean for advertisers. So it was proposed in January 2017. It was intended to complement and come into force around the same time as the General Data Protection Regulation, which has now been enforced since May 2018. And it contains a number of measures which could have quite a significant impact on online advertising and the wider digital media ecosystem. So firstly, under the proposed regulation, consent would be the only legal basis for collecting data via trackers, including cookies, meaning that if consumers do not opt in, this could reduce access to data used by advertisers for ad targeting and for measurement purposes, for example. Then secondly, the proposed regulation would mandate how, where, and when consent to online tracking should be gathered. So that shifts the consent requirement from a website level, so the cookie banner popping up when you visit a website, into the browser or app level. So that means users would have to make a decision as to whether or not they want cookies to be collected online for all future browsing when they download the browser at the point of installation. Then thirdly, the proposal also notes that access to content cannot be made conditional on, well, policymakers are arguing that access to content cannot be made conditional on user consent, meaning that the regulation could make it illegal to deny users access to an online service if they do not give consent for data processing. So this has a potentially broader strategic implication. It could call into question the viability of the entire ad-funded model. So this strict interpretation could nudge potentially publishers away from free ad-based model into a basic subscription model, because without tracking, advertising on a publisher website might yield less value for them, and subscription models might be a more consistent and predictable source of income, and that could dramatically transform the ad-funded business model of the internet as we actually know it. So those are kind of the three broad measures in the ePrivacy proposal, which could really impact advertisers. And we've been advocating now on this file for many years, and I thought it might be interesting for me to just briefly cover what our main position has been and what we've been advocating for with EU policymakers. So we've really been pushing for a number of exceptions to the requirement to get consent for collecting data via trackers for key advertising activities. So for example, we've been advocating for an exception for the purpose of measuring the effectiveness of ads, for an exception so that advertisers can continue to use trackers and tags to identify likely advertising fraud. We've been calling for an exception to the requirement to get consent so that advertisers can continue using tools to avoid their ads from being placed next to illegal and harmful content. And we've been advocating for an exception to the requirement to get consent so that advertisers can reduce consumer annoyance and bombardment, in other words, to prevent users from being served the same or irrelevant ads multiple times. So secondly, as I mentioned, the ePrivacy regulation would mandate how, where, and when consent to online tracking should be gathered. So that would shift the consent requirement from website level to browser level. We've been advocating for the deletion of this article and for any prescriptive requirements about how, where, and when consent should be gathered. You know, we've advocated against any prescriptive regulation of just one method of asking for consent. Rather, we feel that users should be able to make choices about their privacy in context and at website level. So for example, when making a purchase on a specific website. And it would of course be quite burdensome actually for consumers, as it would mean they might have to go back and forth between software settings and websites, particularly on those websites where cookies are actually necessary. And then finally, we've been pushing for the text to enable websites the right to offer services in exchange against the possibility of data processing. So this value exchange, claiming that publishers cannot be forced to offer content to all users, which could be detrimental for the European digital economy. So in February, we finally saw a kind of a monumental breakthrough for the ePrivacy, for negotiations in the ePrivacy regulation. I've kind of covered it previously, but before a piece of regulation is approved, you know, all the institutions have to get together and agree on a final text. And we're at a stage now where the three institutions have come up with their positions, and they now have to get together and agree on a final compromise text. And I don't want to get, I don't want to cover this too much, but I just want this to highlight really that what we're seeing is quite a substantial difference between the position that the EU member states have taken in the Council and the position that the Parliament has taken. And what we can see from this is that we're going to see discussions around some of the key measures that are relevant for advertisers, such as the exception to the requirement to get consent, or whether consent will have to be gathered at browser level, or whether there'll be an exception for ad fraud, or whether publishers will be able to make access to content conditional on user consent. These are likely to be some of the key points of debate and some of the key sticking points during negotiations, with the Council offering a higher level of flexibility for advertisers and for companies for data processing and collection via trackers and cookies, versus the European Parliament that has taken a bit more of a restrictive approach. So yeah, all that to say, 4 years negotiations have been ongoing, but we're not quite at the end yet. We're into the final stages, but now they all need to come to a compromise agreement. And what we've seen already is that the European Parliament is already saying that they're not very happy with the position that the member states have taken, which just shows that it's likely to be quite a battle, and will of course be following this process and continue to advocate for the advertiser position. Now, mindful of time, I've been talking for quite a while, but I promise I'm on to the last part now. So the digital taxes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, these have also become a top priority for our members, given the potential implications that they could have on advertisers, even though they're not directed at advertisers specifically. So firstly, what are digital services taxes? They're levies placed on revenues generated from the provision of certain digital activities, including revenues created from selling online advertising space, facilitating the sale of goods and services, and in some cases selling user data. In most cases, these taxes will only apply to companies with total global and national revenues above a certain threshold. For example, in France, this threshold could be over 750 million euros of global turnover, and will therefore in practice only apply to large search engines, social media services, and online marketplaces, which derive value from users. And the objective of these digital taxes are, according to policymakers, to improve the fairness and efficiency of national tax systems in response to some of the challenges faced by the digitalization of the economy. Notably that under the current international tax frameworks, the value that businesses really derive from user participation and their data is not taken into account when calculating the profits that businesses make in different countries. So we've seen these kinds of taxes pop up all over the world, each with different approaches, applying different levies, applying to different digital services. And the EU is the most recent to be added to this list. So it's recently launched another public consultation, and it plans to launch a proposal for a digital levy in the second quarter of this year. So at the same time, despite the fact that there's many different taxes that are popping up, several governments still believe that the most sustainable long-term solution to tax challenges is via the Organization for Economic Development. So there are negotiations currently ongoing at OECD level for a multilateral approach. These have been going on for a couple of years. As you can imagine, it's quite a politically sensitive issue, but there are some people saying that an agreement could be found in July of this year. So I've touched upon it before. Why are they relevant for advertisers? The main issue here really is that digital giants such as Google, Facebook, or Amazon, who are the main targets of these taxes, are likely to just respond by passing them down to their business users, like a typical indirect tax, and increasing the price of their services. So this has already been the case in Austria, in Turkey, in the UK, France, and Spain, where Google have upped the price of advertising in response to the taxes that had been enforced in those markets. So that means that advertisers will be paying more for the same advertising services at a time, in fact, when marketing budgets have been in record decline. And this is likely to continue to be the case wherever new taxes are introduced. So what we've done is we've developed a global position on digital taxes. And the main point that we make here is that the digital tax debates that have arisen as a result of the digitalization of the economy are global in nature and therefore warrant a global solution. We believe that a global approach will ensure consistency and avoid the creation of a patchwork of digital taxation measures. We also argue that digital taxes which apply to large online platforms will most likely be passed onto and paid by their business users, thereby resulting in increases in the prices of their services, including in online advertising. But given the fact that digital advertising market is dominated by two online platforms, Google and Facebook, advertisers actually maybe don't have the ability to switch to other vendors in response to price increases. So that means that advertisers will be forced to pay more for the same advertising services and media, as I said. And then finally, we just highlight, our plan is to highlight and advocate that advertising revenues continue to support the global economy as well as the online ecosystem, and digital taxes that are passed down to advertisers could result in unintended consequences, potentially even impacting COVID-19 economic recovery. And here again, just want to say that we're right at the beginning. There's not even a proposal at EU level yet on the table. It's likely to be around July of this year, and then we'll enter into a normal legislative process, which means, again, all the institutions will have to come up with their own position on this text and then come to a final agreement. So we can't envisage really an EU digital levy coming into place for a couple of years yet. And then just a final little plug. I just want to say that we have our Global Marketer Week coming up in April, in just under a month. This is open to everyone. So you can just scan, I'll just leave this up here for a couple of seconds. If you'd like to register, you can just scan the barcode and it will take you right to the registration page. Other than that, thank you so much for listening to me for a good 45 minutes. I hope that was useful and gave you a good overview of some of the work that we're doing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we've got. I see we might have a couple in the Q&A, Barry.
Nothing but compliments, I think, Gabby.
Oh, great.
That was a tremendous presentation. Well done. It's my second time looking at this now, and it's very, very enjoyable and informative. There's a couple of things, Gabby, just to say over here. That the spend for Google and Facebook, their share of the digital spend is estimated to be a staggering 83% in the Republic of Ireland in 2021. And that's up from around 42% 10 years ago. And to put this into context, digital advertising revenues for all the main Irish news publishers amounted to just 21 million last year, if my figures are correct, which I think they are. Digital is extremely difficult to get accurate information on due to the lack of data from Google and Facebook. This is a major bugbear over here. I presume it's the exact same across Europe. Google and Facebook just won't release any accurate data. Hence, it's not transparent, it's opaque. And given the timelines that you've outlined there, another 2 to 3 years of this going on, it's just going to go on and on and on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really good point to make. I mean, it's not just advertisers that are saying that this is an issue. We've seen now market investigations in the UK, in Australia, in the US that have identified, that these platforms are able to collect these vast amounts of data, and that they really don't share, that they don't share them with their business users, and players aren't, they're not, there's a lot of mismatch between platforms and advertisers and the rest of the advertising ecosystem. So yeah, I mean, regulation, it's going to be a few years before we see this kind of regulation come into place. And of course, we also have to bear in mind that the big platforms are very engaged as well on these topics. They also have people on the ground in the EU, in the UK and Australia that are also advocating for their own position. So it's going to be quite a long battle over the next coming years. But what we are hearing is that, yes, advertisers are saying, you know, we need more transparency into the so-called walled gardens. We need it for ad measurement. We need it for brand safety. We need it to detect ad fraud. All of these, which are key, you know, they're key advertising activities. And without that, there's yeah, as you say, it's completely intransparent and advertisers are struggling.
Yeah. And in the meantime, I think if my figures are correct again, digital advertising spend is expected to exceed 50% of the total ad spend in the Republic of Ireland this year, and it's going to go on and on and on. So it's amazing. As an advertiser who provides the budget for all of this, we continue to increase our spend on digital with a lack of transparency going on as well. I find it very difficult to comprehend. That's what's going on. I have a question here from Kira Holmes. Assume initiatives such as Apple's introduction of iOS 14 around new privacy features, including consumer opt-in for permission to track, is seen as a positive step despite the headaches for digital marketers.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk at the moment about kind of what some of the big tech companies like Apple, like Google are doing to create a more pro-privacy environment for consumers. And it's interesting because it does kind of play into some of the regulations that are currently under consideration. So if you think about the ePrivacy regulation, which is trying to introduce new rules on the use of cookies, you know, we're already moving towards the demise of the third-party cookie. So if we've got another 3 years to wait before regulation, it's just interesting to note that there are already advertising market dynamics that are shifting. We're shifting away from the use of third-party cookies anyway. So what will a regulation that comes in 3 years down the line really mean in practice? So it's good that you know, behind the kind of regulation, there's a lot of shifts happening in the industry that you need to take into account.
Yeah. I don't think there are any more questions, Gabby. I know you and I have a meeting again in about an hour's time, so I'm not to delay you. Thank you so much for your time today and for the prep work. It's very, very informative. And it's a subject matter that I just wasn't aware of at all, to be honest with you, the detail. So if anyone has any queries, don't hesitate to get in contact with us here. There will be a recording of the webinar available later. And without further ado, thank you, Gabby, and thank you all for participating this morning. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.